Number 1. Cyntoia Brown. She was 16 years old, sitting in a Nashville courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hair in braided pigtails. And she looked, by every account in that room, like she should have been heading to school. Instead, she was on trial for murder. What makes that image so haunting is not the crime itself. It's the life that led her there, and the question that would take 15 years, 2 documentaries, and a national movement to even begin answering. Was Cyntoia Brown a killer or a child the system had already abandoned? Cyntoia Denise Brown was born January 29, 1988, to a teenage mother who was already deep in addiction. Her biological mother drank heavily throughout the pregnancy and used crack cocaine in the final months, a detail that would later play a significant role in Brown's legal defense. She was given up for adoption before she turned 2 and taken in by Elinette Brown, a teacher who by all accounts provided a stable and loving home. But by the time Cyntoia was 12, something had shifted. She started running away. She struggled in school. Mood swings came in waves, periods of lightness followed by stretches of deep, inconsolable sadness. Forensic psychiatrists would later conclude she showed signs of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, affecting her cognition, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Now she cycled through juvenile facilities in Tennessee for several years. Records show she spent time at Woodland Hills Youth Development Center in Nashville after repeated incidents. Each time she was placed, she found a way out until the summer of 2004, when she ran for the last time and ended up alone on the streets of Nashville. That's where she met Garion McLaughlin. He went by the street name Cutthroat, and he was 24 years old to her 16. What began as a relationship quickly became something far darker. According to Brown's later testimony and court records, McLaughlin physically assaulted her regularly, choking her into unconsciousness, pulling a gun on her, forcing her to use drugs. He also forced her into prostitution, sending her out to bring back money. She had nowhere to go and no one to call. She was, by legal definition, a child trafficking victim, but no one called it that in 2004. August 5th, 2004. McLaughlin struck her and sent her out to make money. A 43-year-old Nashville real estate agent named Johnny Allen spotted her and offered her food and $50. He drove her to his home on the south side of the city. According to Brown, once inside, Allen's behavior unnerved her. He had guns throughout the house, kept standing over her as she tried to rest, and refused to let her leave. She grew convinced, she later said, that she was not going to make it out of that house alive. Though in the early hours of August 6th, she reached into her purse, retrieved a .40 caliber handgun she had been carrying, and fired a single shot. Johnny Allen died at the scene. Before dawn broke, Brown left with his wallet, his pants, and 2 of his firearms. She returned to the motel where she and McLaughlin were staying. Within hours, Nashville police received a 911 call. Responding officers found Allen's body, a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. By the next morning, investigators had located Allen's truck in a nearby parking lot. By August 8th, 16-year-old Cyntoia Brown was under arrest. She waived her Miranda rights and spoke freely with detectives. She told them what had happened, that she had been solicited, that she feared for her life, that she had acted in self-defense. Prosecutors saw something very different. They argued that Allen had been asleep when he was shot, that the robbery was the motive, and that Cyntoia Brown had gone to that house not as a victim, but as a predator. In 2006, Brown was tried as an adult in Davidson County, Tennessee. The defense argued she was a traumatized, trafficked child with a compromised mental state who had genuinely feared for her life. Expert witnesses testified about her fetal alcohol disorder, her abuse, and the impossible circumstances she had been placed in. The prosecution countered that the evidence, the stolen wallet, the guns she took, nay, the report she had suggested going back for more, pointed not to self-defense but to calculated robbery. After deliberating, the jury sided with the state. Cyntoia Brown was found guilty of first-degree murder, felony murder, and aggravated robbery. The sentence, life in prison, with no eligibility for parole until she had served 51 years, meaning she would be 69 years old before she could even ask for release. For years, the case smoldered. Then, in 2011, a PBS documentary called Me Facing Life: Cyntoia's Story brought it to a wider audience. The film sat in the cultural consciousness until November 2017, when Rihanna shared Brown's story on Instagram. Within days, Kim Kardashian, LeBron James, and Snoop Dogg had added their voices. The hashtag #FreeCyntoiaBrown went viral. A movement had been born. A clemency hearing followed. The Tennessee Board of Parole deadlocked. 3 different directions, no consensus. Then the Tennessee Supreme Court ruled in December 2018 that Brown would indeed need to serve the full 51 years. The public response was overwhelming. Letters flooded the governor's office. Rallies were held. And on January 7th, 2019, outgoing Governor Bill Haslam made his decision. He granted Cyntoia Brown full clemency, citing the harshness of a life sentence imposed on a juvenile. On August 7th, see 2019, exactly 15 years after the night that changed everything, she walked out of the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center a free woman. She had earned her GED, an associate degree with a 4.0 GPA, and by the time of her release was just one course away from a bachelor's degree from Lipscomb University, all completed behind bars. She married musician Jay Long in 2015 while still incarcerated. And together they founded a nonprofit dedicated to supporting young survivors of human trafficking. Cyntoia Brown's story became a turning point in how Tennessee, and much of the country, talks about juvenile justice and child exploitation. But as complicated and contested as her case was, the next story on this list involves a perpetrator with no such ambiguity, a predator who didn't leave survivors behind to tell the story. Then number 2, Paul Dennis Reed. He arrived in Nashville wearing cowboy boots, a wide-brimmed hat, and a story about being the next Garth Brooks. He told people his name was Justin Parks. He took music lessons, talked about record deals, and charmed his way into the city's orbit of dreamers and hopefuls. Nobody looked too closely, and that was exactly what Paul Dennis Reed was counting on. Paul Dennis Reed Jr. was born November 12, 1957, in Richland Hills, in Texas, a Fort Worth suburb, where not much was expected of him and even less was provided. The youngest of 3 children, he was raised largely by his paternal grandmother, a woman he later nearly killed by setting her bed on fire while she slept in it. He was sent to a boys' home after that. School revealed severe learning disabilities that went unaddressed. By 16, he was on his own. By his mid-20s, he had already built a criminal record that included armed robbery of a Houston steakhouse, for which he received a 20-year sentence. He served only 7 before being paroled in 1990. Texas let him go. He spent the next few years drifting until September of 1995, when he appeared in Nashville, reinvented as Justin Parks, full-time dreamer and aspiring country star. He found a boarding house, took a few guitar lessons, and landed a job as a line cook at a local restaurant. But the music never materialized. The bookings never came. The dream that had carried him 1,500 miles from Texas began to dissolve, and something darker took its place. By early 1997, Paul Reed was working as a dishwasher at a Shoney's in the Donelson neighborhood of Nashville. He owed money, kept to himself, and had a short fuse. On February 15, 1997, he lost his temper during a shift, threw a plate at another employee, and was fired on the spot. He was done with trying. He had made himself a promise after his Texas conviction. He would never again leave a witness behind. The next morning, February 16, 1997, Steve Hampton and Sarah Jackson were opening Captain D's on Lebanon Road. Hampton was 25 years old, a father of 3 who had worked his way up to manager since he was 15. Jackson was 16, a high school student working part-time just down the street from her house. At some point before the breakfast rush, there was a knock at the front door. A large man with a friendly smile was standing outside, holding what appeared to be a job application. Hampton unlocked the door. The moment he did, the smile vanished. Reed pulled a weapon, forced them both into the walk-in cooler, ordered them to lie face down on the floor, and shot each of them in the back of the head. He cleared out the safe, taking roughly $7,000, removed the surveillance tapes, and walked back out into the Sunday morning sunlight. Police found shoe prints. They found employee accounts of a man who had visited the night before asking about a cooking job. They even identified Reed as a person of interest through his Shoney's employment records. But a background check cleared him at the time, and the investigation moved on. 5 weeks passed. On the evening of March 23rd, Reed appeared behind a McDonald's in the Hermitage neighborhood. Just 3.5 miles from Captain D's, as the closing crew was stepping out through the back door. He forced 4 employees back inside at gunpoint, herded them into the storeroom, took $3,000 from the registers, and then opened fire. Andrea Brown, 17. Ronald Santiago, 27. Robert Sewell, 23. All 3 died at the scene. A 4th employee, 22-year-old Jose Gonzalez, survived only because Reed's weapon misfired. And Reed then stabbed Gonzalez 17 times and left him for dead. Gonzalez lay completely still until he heard the door close, then crawled to a telephone and dialed 911. He lived, and he remembered everything. Nashville went into a cold panic. The city now understood it had a serial killer. The media had a name for him before law enforcement had a face: the fast food killer. On April 23rd, Reed drove 40 miles north to Clarksville, Tennessee. The Baskin-Robbins on Wilma Rudolph Boulevard was closing for the night when he appeared at the door and talked his way inside. Angela Holmes was 21. Michelle Mace was 16. Reed took the cash, forced both women into his car, and drove them to Dunbar Cave State Park. Their bodies were found the following morning. Both had been killed with a knife. He had changed his method. He had changed his city. But he had not changed his rule about witnesses. Then, on June 1st, 1997, Reed made the mistake that ended everything. He drove to the home of Mitchell Roberts, the Shoney's manager who had fired him, and knocked on the front door. Roberts' son happened to be recording a home video. The footage captured what came next. Reed, outside the door, producing a gun and a pair of handcuffs, demanding that Roberts put them on and come with him. Roberts slammed the door and barricaded his family inside. When Nashville police arrived and arrested Reed, they found the man Mitchell Roberts described matched the composite sketches from 3 separate crime scenes. Jose Gonzalez identified Reed in a lineup. Fingerprints found at the Baskin-Robbins matched Reed's. Steve Hampton's driver's license, with Reed's fingerprints on it, was recovered from a median on Ellington Parkway. Biological evidence from the Baskin-Robbins victims was found inside Reed's car. A gas receipt placed him near Dunbar Cave the night of the murders. Piece by piece, the case assembled itself around him with devastating precision. Between April 1999 and May 2000, Paul Dennis Reed faced 3 separate capital murder trials. The media coverage was so overwhelming that jurors had to be imported from East and West Tennessee. No one in Middle Tennessee could be expected to be impartial. In each trial, Reed's defense suggested mental illness and delusion. Reed himself claimed that government conspiracies were rigging the proceedings. Jurors disagreed. He was convicted on all 7 counts of first-degree murder. Sentence after sentence was handed down, until Reed had accumulated 7 death penalties, the most ever imposed on a single person in the history of the state of Tennessee. He spent over 15 years on death row, filing and withdrawing appeals in erratic cycles. In 2003, he came within hours of execution before pulling back at the last moment. His legal maneuvering dragged the process out year after year, keeping the families of his victims in a prolonged state of uncertainty. In the end, it wasn't the state that ended Paul Dennis Reed's life. On November 1st, 2013, he died at Nashville General Hospital from complications of pneumonia, heart failure, and respiratory failure. He was 55 years old, 11 days shy of his 56th birthday. The executioner never got the chance. The 7 people he killed were young, working late shifts, saving up for school, raising children, just trying to get through the week. Their names were Sarah Jackson, Steve Hampton, Andrea Brown, Ronald Santiago, Robert Sewell, Angela Holmes, and Michelle Mace. Paul Reed spent years making sure the world remembered his name. The least we can do is remember theirs. But the next case on this list takes us even further into darkness, to a crime committed not by a drifter in the shadows, but by a teenager on a university campus who would become the youngest woman ever sentenced to die in the United States. Number 3, Krista Pike. The morning after Colleen Slemmer was murdered, Krista Pike sat down in the Job Corps cafeteria and ate breakfast. She pulled something out of her jacket pocket, set it on the tray, and told the person sitting next to her, matter-of-factly, what it was: a piece of bone, a fragment of Colleen's skull. She was 18 years old, and she was smiling. Ed Krista Gale Pike was born March 10th, 1976, in Beckley, West Virginia, and almost nothing in her earliest years pointed toward stability. Her parents fought, separated, reconciled, and separated again. Her mother drank through her pregnancy, a detail that would later surface in court as evidence of possible neurological damage. As a toddler, Krista was found crawling through filth in the home, while her mother continued a chaotic lifestyle that caseworkers documented repeatedly. As the word neglect appeared in records before she could even read, sexual abuse entered her story early. Violence was not an exception in her childhood. It was the weather. By her teens, Pike had bounced through enough troubled circumstances that she eventually landed in Job Corps, a federally funded program designed to give at-risk young people vocational training, structure, and a second chance. She was sent to the Knoxville, Tennessee Center on Dale Avenue in the mid-90s. On paper, it was exactly the kind of intervention her life needed. In practice, she arrived carrying everything she had always been: volatile, jealous, and magnetic enough to draw followers. At the Job Corps Center, Pike met 17-year-old Tatteril Shipp. They became a couple quickly, and Pike's attachment to him was intense, as both shared an interest in the occult and reportedly considered themselves practitioners of Satanism, something investigators would later note when they found a satanic Bible and a makeshift altar in Shipp's room. Also at the center was a 19-year-old from Florida named Colleen Slemmer. She and Pike had a tense relationship from the start. Pike had become convinced, without clear evidence, that Slemmer was interested in Shipp and was trying to come between them. On January 11th, 1995, Pike told a fellow student named Kim Ilo directly that she was going to kill Colleen Slemmer. She said she just felt mean that day. Ilo did not report it. The next evening, January 12th, at around 8 o'clock, Ilo watched Pike, Shipp, Slemmer, and a fourth student named Shadala Peterson leave the dormitory together, walking towards 17th Street. Pike had lured Slemmer with the promise of marijuana and a video. It was a cold and rainy night in Knoxville. The group made their way down the Cumberland Avenue Strip and cut through Tyson Park onto the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus, a stretch of land that, at that hour, was completely empty. Once they were far enough from the dorms, Pike turned on Slemmer. She accused her of trying to steal Shipp. When Slemmer denied it, Pike attacked her and did not stop for the next 30 to 60 minutes. What followed was one of the most disturbing crimes in Tennessee's recorded history. If court records and the medical examiner's testimony describe wounds so numerous across Slemmer's body that the Knox County forensic pathologist eventually stopped trying to catalog every one of them individually, stating she would have needed 3 days just to document them all. A small meat cleaver and a box cutter were among the weapons used. Slemmer tried to run, multiple times. Each time she was chased down and the assault continued. Near the end, Pike slammed a large piece of asphalt into Slemmer's skull, fracturing it fatally. As Slemmer lay dying in the dirt at the base of a tree, Pike bent down and removed a fragment of her skull. She kept it in her pocket. Peterson, who had stood watch during the attack, left with Pike and Shipp. Colleen Slemmer's body was found the following morning by 2 University of Tennessee groundskeepers who initially could not determine that what they were looking at was a human being. The investigation moved fast. Police quickly noted that 4 students had signed out of the Job Corps dormitories that night, and only 3 had returned. Within 36 hours, Pike, Shipp, and Peterson were all in custody. When investigators searched Shipp's room, they found the satanic materials. When they searched Pike's belongings, they found the skull fragment. That same night, Pike had gone to Ilo's room, the same friend she had told about her intentions 24 hours earlier, and described what had happened in detail. She was, by multiple accounts, cheerful. Investigators also recovered 2 of Slemmer's identification cards from a nearby Texaco station, along with a pair of black gloves Pike had used. The evidence was overwhelming, and then Pike gave a full confession. At trial, in March 1996, the prosecution laid out the confession, the physical evidence, and even the testimony of multiple witnesses, and the medical examiner's findings. The defense centered on mental illness, arguing that Pike suffered from borderline personality disorder, that she had lost control, and that her deeply traumatic childhood should factor into any sentence. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. On March 22, 1996, Krista Gale Pike was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. 8 days later, on March 30th, the sentence came down death by electrocution, plus 25 years for the conspiracy charge. At 18 years old, she became the youngest woman in the United States to be sentenced to death in the post-Furman era, meaning the modern period of capital punishment, following the Supreme Court's 1972 reinstatement of the death penalty. Tatteril Shipp was tried separately in 1997. Because he had been 17 at the time of the murder, 1 year younger than Pike, he was ineligible for the death penalty under federal law. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole, plus 25 consecutive years for conspiracy. He was denied parole in October 2025, with his case deferred until 2031. Shadala Peterson, who cooperated with prosecutors, received probation. Pike has spent nearly 3 decades on death row at the Tennessee Prison for Women. Her legal journey has been relentless. She launched appeals, withdrew them, relaunched them, and fought her sentence through every available channel. In 2012, she attempted to manipulate a civilian visitor into helping her escape, resulting in an additional 25-year sentence for solicitation of murder and attempted escape. Courts have rejected her claims of ineffective counsel, unconstitutional sentencing, and medical concerns about the execution method. In January 2025, she filed suit arguing that lethal injection would violate her rights given a medical condition she claims causes excessive blood clotting. That lawsuit remains pending. In October 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court set an execution date, September 30th, 2026. If it proceeds, Krista Pike will be the first woman executed in Tennessee since 1819, more than 200 years. Colleen Slemmer's mother, Mae Martinez, has spent 3 decades fighting to have her daughter's remains returned and her killer brought to justice. As of this recording, one bone fragment, the piece Pike removed that night, has never been returned. "Execute her," Martinez has said, "or give me the rest of Colleen back." As chilling as this case is, the next one takes us from a university campus to the heart of Nashville's legal world, where a prominent attorney made his wife disappear. He then spent nearly a decade running from the truth. Number 4. Perry March. The note was typed. That was the first thing Janet's mother noticed, and the first thing that didn't feel right. Janet March had always written her notes by hand. She never used capital letters in them. She dated every page at the top. The document Perry March handed investigators, a tidy typewritten list titled Janet's 12-day vacation, matched none of those habits. It was polished, clinical, and perfect. And it was almost certainly written by the man who had just made his wife disappear. Perry Avram March was born to be impressive. He was articulate, ambitious, and the kind of man who moved through elite spaces with total ease. He grew up in modest circumstances, but clawed his way into the upper register of Nashville society through sheer determination and intelligence. Then he met Janet Levine while both were students at the University of Michigan. She was the wealthy daughter of prominent Nashville attorney Lawrence Levine, an artist with a generous spirit and a wide circle of devoted friends. She proposed to Perry. They married in June of 1987, moved back to Nashville, where Perry enrolled at Vanderbilt University School of Law, and built what appeared to be an enviable life. Perry worked in tax and corporate law. Janet illustrated children's books. He designed furniture and was raising 2 young children, Samson and Zipporah, in a newly renovated house in the affluent Forest Hills neighborhood. But behind the polished surface, the marriage was fracturing. By the summer of 1996, records indicate Janet had quietly made an appointment with a divorce attorney. That appointment was scheduled for August 16, 1996. She never kept it. On the night of August 15, 1996, contractors finished up renovation work at the March home in Forest Hills. Janet was seen alive and well by both of them as they let themselves out. Those 2 men would be among the last people outside the family to see her. What happened after they left has never been fully established in a court of law, but Perry March's own father would later confirm under oath that his son killed Janet that night. When Perry called Janet's parents, Lawrence and Carolyn Levine, around midnight, He told them his wife had packed 3 bags, withdrawn $5,000 in cash. He'd taken her passport and left on an unplanned vacation because of marital difficulties. The Levines were confused but not immediately alarmed. Janet could be spontaneous. But when Janet missed her son, Sammy's 6th birthday on August 25th without a single phone call, the alarm bells rang. Perry waited until August 29th, 2 full weeks after Janet disappeared, to file a missing persons report. Within days, the investigation produced glaring inconsistencies. As Janet's credit cards had gone completely dark, no calls to friends, no hotel check-ins, no trace of activity anywhere. Her 1996 Volvo was eventually found abandoned at a nearby apartment complex, not driven away on a road trip, but parked and left, with her passport still inside and her sandals placed neatly in front of the vehicle as if arranged. A neighbor came forward and told detectives he had spotted a man pushing a bicycle near that parking lot around 1:30 in the morning on the night Janet vanished. He said the man locked eyes with him. He said there was no doubt it was Perry March. Perry then replaced the tires on Janet's car shortly after it was found, telling the tire shop they were worn. The shop later told investigators the tires were in perfectly good condition, and that when pressed, then Perry had simply said he wanted a different brand. Nashville police announced they were treating the case as a homicide. Perry stopped cooperating. He attended none of Janet's memorial services. A month after Janet vanished, he packed up the children and left for Chicago. By 1999, he had relocated to the lakeside town of Ajijic, Mexico, where he and his father Arthur eventually settled into a comfortable expatriate existence, Perry even opening a small restaurant with his new wife. But the Levines did not stop fighting. For nearly a decade, they battled Perry in court over custody of their grandchildren, wrongful death civil suits, and the administration of Janet's estate. In mid-2004, a Davidson County civil judge found Perry legally liable for Janet's death. That same year, after presenting 59 witnesses over a single day of testimony, a Davidson County grand jury returned a sealed indictment charging Perry March with second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. The indictment remained secret for months while FBI agents and U.S. immigration officials conducted high-level negotiations with Mexico. Then, on the morning of August 3, 2005, Perry March sat down to breakfast at his restaurant in Ajijic. Several armed men walked in and placed him under arrest. He was flown to a California detention facility, then transferred to Nashville. During the flight back to Tennessee, he turned to cold case detective Pat Postiglione and said, unprompted, "Prior to the Janet incident, I have not been involved in any other criminal-type activity. It was the kind of sentence only a guilty man would construct. What happened next stunned even seasoned investigators. While Perry sat in the Davidson County Jail awaiting trial, he began recruiting a fellow inmate named Russell Ferris to commit murder, specifically to kill Lawrence and Carolyn Levine, his in-laws. Perry offered to pay Ferris's bond. Instead, Ferris called his attorney, who called police. Recording devices were placed in the jail. In one captured conversation, Perry told Ferris he couldn't say how excited he was about the plan. Perry was then recorded making calls to his own father, Arthur March, back in Mexico, relaying instructions. The plot escalated. At one point, an FBI agent intercepted Arthur March at the Guadalajara airport as he arrived to meet a hitman who had, by then, already been detained by Mexican immigration authorities. As both Perry and Arthur were charged with solicitation and conspiracy to commit murder. Arthur, facing extradition, eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. In a pre-trial deposition, he confirmed that Perry had killed Janet on the night of August 15, 1996, and that he had personally helped his son move her body, wrapping it first in a garbage bag, transporting it to Kentucky for disposal. He could not, however, recall the exact location. Janet March's remains have never been found. At trial in August 2006, the jury was brought in from Chattanooga. The media saturation in Nashville made local selection impossible. The case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, including Arthur March's deposition played on video, the jailhouse recordings, and testimony from a Mexican attorney who recalled Perry saying, during a business dispute in 2001, that he would do away with his adversaries the same way he had done with his wife. The defense attacked the credibility of every witness. But after a week of testimony, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges: second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Perry March was sentenced to 56 years in prison. The conviction came almost exactly 10 years and 2 days after Janet was killed. Arthur March pled guilty to federal charges and received a 5-year sentence. He died in federal prison. Perry March remains incarcerated today, his location undisclosed. And somewhere, Janet March is still out there, unfound, unreturned to the family that never stopped looking for her. Janet March's story is a case of a woman robbed of everything: her life, her children, even her burial. The next case on this list involves a different kind of disappearance. A young woman taken from her front yard in broad daylight, in a rural Tennessee community that would never be the same again. Number 5, Holly Bobo. At 4:30 in the morning, Holly Bobo's alarm clock went off. She had an early class. She was 20 years old, a second-year nursing student at the University of Tennessee at Martin, and by every account from everyone who knew her, shy, devoted, kind. The kind of person who became a nurse because she genuinely wanted to take care of people. She made breakfast that morning, got ready, and stepped outside. She never made it to her car. Holly Lynn Bobo grew up in Darden, a small rural community in Decatur County, Tennessee. A place where people leave their doors unlocked and know their neighbors by name. Her parents, Dana and Karen, raised her and her older brother Clint in a modest home surrounded by woods and farmland. The kind of Tennessee landscape that stretches for miles without a stoplight. Holly was described by everyone who knew her as quiet and gentle, someone who kept a small circle but loved fiercely within it. She was the cousin of country singer Whitney Duncan. She had plans. She was in her second year of nursing school. She had a life mapped out in front of her. April 13th, 2011 began like any ordinary Wednesday in Darden. Then Karen Bobo had already left for her job as a school teacher. She taught 4th grade at a local elementary school. Holly was getting ready to head to class. Clint, then 25 and working toward his own degree in social work, was also home that morning. Around 7:30, a neighbor called Karen at work, saying she thought she had heard a scream from the direction of the Bobo property. Karen called Clint. Clint went outside and looked toward the tree line. That's what he saw has stayed with him ever since. He spotted his younger sister walking with a man at the edge of the woods. A man Clint did not recognize, wearing camouflage. The way he later described it, it did not look like Holly was in distress. But something told him it was wrong. He told investigators he thought it might be Holly's boyfriend. He went back inside. By the time he processed what he had seen and went back out, Holly was gone. The man in camouflage was gone. The tree line was empty. Holly Bobo simply was not there anymore. Within hours, one of the most extensive searches in Tennessee history was underway. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation called it the most expensive and exhaustive investigation the agency had ever conducted. Hundreds of volunteers combed the woods, fields, and logging roads of Decatur County. Army helicopters swept the terrain. Cadaver dogs worked in teams. And investigators pulled at every thread they could find. But Holly wasn't there. The days turned into weeks. The weeks became months. She remained missing. Early in the investigation, several names surfaced, including brothers Zach and Dylan Adams, and 2 associates named Shane Austin and Jason Autry, all from the same rural corner of West Tennessee. All 4 were questioned. All 4 had what appeared to be alibis at the time. All investigators also looked closely at a convicted sex offender named Terry Britt, who lived near the Bobo home, conducting searches of his property and vehicles. No physical evidence connected him. The case went cold. Then, in 2013, Dylan Adams was arrested on an unrelated weapons charge. During subsequent interrogations, something shifted. Dylan eventually told investigators that he had gone to his brother Zach's house on April 13th, 2011, to pick up his truck, and had seen Holly Bobo there, alive. That single statement broke the case open. In March 2014, nearly 3 years after Holly vanished, a Decatur County grand jury indicted Zachary Adams on charges of especially aggravated kidnapping and first-degree felony murder. Jason Autry was indicted shortly after. Then, on September 7, 2014, 2 men searching for wild ginseng in the woods of northern Decatur County, about 20 miles from the Bobo home, made a discovery: human remains. The following day, Then the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation confirmed they belonged to Holly Bobo. A bullet wound to the back of the skull had been the cause of death. She had been out there for over 3 years. 5 months later, in February 2015, one of the other men charged in the case, Shane Austin, who had initially cooperated with prosecutors before authorities said he stopped being truthful, was found dead in a Florida hotel room in an apparent suicide. His immunity deal had been revoked. He never stood trial. Zachary Adams's trial finally began in September of 2017, 6 years after Holly disappeared. The proceedings were moved to Hardin County after the judge determined a fair jury could not be seated in the area where the crime occurred. The trial ran for 11 emotionally charged days. The prosecution's star witness was Jason Autry, who testified in detail about helping Adams dispose of what Autry believed was a body wrapped in a blanket in the bed of a pickup truck, and then at the Tennessee River near an Interstate 40 bridge, realizing that Holly was still alive. He testified that Adams then shot her. Other witnesses relayed deeply disturbing statements Adams had allegedly made after Holly's disappearance, to a friend, to a former girlfriend, to fellow jail inmates. That Karen Bobo took the stand and collapsed while being asked to hold some of her daughter's belongings. The courtroom went silent. The defense argued that Autry was an unreliable felon who had fabricated his story to save himself, that there was no DNA evidence connecting Adams to Holly, and that the case rested almost entirely on the testimony of someone with every reason to lie. On September 22, 2017, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts, first-degree murder, and especially aggravated kidnapping and aggravated rape. Zachary Adams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 50 additional years for the kidnapping and rape convictions. His brother Dylan entered an Alford plea in January 2018, acknowledging the prosecution's case could result in a conviction without personally admitting guilt, and received 35 years. Jason Autry received 8 years and was released in 2020, but the case did not end there. And after his release, Autry recanted his entire trial testimony, claiming he had fabricated key details under pressure from his attorney, who warned him conviction was nearly certain. In January 2024, Zachary Adams filed a petition for a new trial based on this recantation. A multi-week evidentiary hearing was held through 2025, examining the recantation, the credibility of witnesses, and potential evidence that was never fully explored at trial. As of early 2026, a ruling is still pending. Whether Zachary Adams receives a new trial, or whether the conviction stands, the one certainty in this case is that Holly Bobo left her home on a quiet April morning and never came back. Her cousin Whitney Duncan wrote a song for her. Her parents have sat through years of hearings and trials, and somewhere in the woods of Decatur County, they finally brought her home. From a rural community rocked by a vanishing to a late-night massacre inside a Nashville Waffle House, the next story involves a nearly naked gunman, 4 people who never made it home from breakfast, and 1 young man who ran toward the danger when everyone else ran away. Number 6. Travis Reinking. Just after 3 in the morning, James Shaw Jr. pulled into the Waffle House parking lot on Murfreesboro Pike in Antioch, Tennessee. He and a friend were grabbing a late bite. As they walked toward the entrance, Shaw noticed something unusual. A man sitting alone in a tan Chevy truck in the parking lot, in the dark, not moving. He couldn't explain it, but he told the court years later, "The energy wasn't right. I could just feel it." They went inside anyway. Within minutes, James Shaw Jr. would either die in that restaurant or become one of the most celebrated strangers in the history of Nashville. Travis Reinking was born in 1989 and grew up in Morton, Illinois, a small town in central Illinois. By all outward appearances, he had a stable upbringing, family, steady employment, no violent criminal history. He worked as a crane operator and was considered capable and dependable on job sites. But in the years leading up to 2018, those closest to him began noticing something deeply wrong. His thinking had begun to fracture. He believed he was being stalked. He believed his computer, his phone, and his identity had been hacked. He wrote letters, one to Taylor Swift, one to Oprah Winfrey, describing the conspiracies he believed were targeting him. In July 2017, he appeared at a restricted area near the White House and was arrested after refusing to leave, telling Secret Service agents he was a citizen of the Taylor Swift Nation and needed to speak with the president. He was briefly committed and evaluated. Illinois State Police revoked his firearm owner identification card and confiscated his weapons, 4 of them, including an AR-15. But there was a fatal gap in the system. The law only required that Ranking surrender his weapons to someone with a valid identification. He handed them to his father, Jeffrey Ranking. His father, despite everything he had witnessed in his son's deteriorating mental state, returned every single one of those weapons to Travis less than a year later. The guns were back in his hands by early 2018. In the weeks before April 22nd, Ranking's delusions had accelerated beyond anything his family or neighbors had seen. He believed someone had broken into his apartment and assaulted him while he slept. He believed CIA agents were following him. He stole a BMW from a Brentwood dealership. The car was recovered and towed by police the day before the shooting. According to testimony at his trial, Ranking later told a psychologist that the towing of the BMW was the final provocation, that police taking his car was a form of punishment he could not tolerate. He wrote that, "This time, I would have to take something they couldn't take back." That night, he drove to a Nashville armory and purchased 3 30-round magazines for his AR-15. Just after 3 in the morning, on April 22, 2018, he parked his truck in the Waffle House lot in Antioch. He was wearing nothing but a green jacket, and he sat in that truck for approximately 4 minutes. Then he stepped out. What followed lasted 42 seconds. Ranking opened fire in the parking lot first, striking Torian Sanderlin, 29, and Joe Perez Jr., 20, before either of them could react. He then entered the restaurant. The plate glass windows shattered inward. People dove beneath booths and tables, ran toward the kitchen, pressed themselves flat against the floor. But a young woman named Kayla Shaw played dead near the entrance, a bullet passing close enough to wound her. Inside, Ranking continued firing, shooting Aquila da Silva, 23, a music engineering student at MTSU, who had come in with his girlfriend and his brother. Da Silva was rushed to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where he later died. Also shot inside was D'Ebony Groves, 21, a senior at Belmont University majoring in social work, out that night celebrating with friends. She died at the scene. He discharged his weapon 30 times in total, 15 rounds outside, 15 inside. His jacket still held 60 unused rounds. That is when James Shaw Jr. moved. Shaw had sprinted to the bathroom corridor near the entrance when the shooting began, a bullet grazing his elbow. He crouched there, watching, calculating. When he saw Ranking lower the rifle, either to reload or because of a malfunction, something locked into place, and he told the court, "There was a voice that told me to do it, and do it now." Shaw lunged from the hallway, grabbed the barrel of the AR-15 with his bare hands, burning his palms on the heated metal, and yanked with everything he had. The 2 men struggled. Shaw wrenched the weapon free and threw it over the counter. Then he physically shoved Travis Ranking out the front door of the restaurant. Ranking fled on foot into the darkness, completely naked. He had shed the jacket in the struggle. Now he was gone. Police arrived within minutes. 4 people were dead. 4 more were injured. And the man responsible had disappeared into suburban Nashville carrying nothing. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation added him to its most wanted list. A 34-hour manhunt followed, with warnings broadcast that Ranking was potentially armed with 2 additional weapons and should be considered extremely dangerous. On April 23rd, the day after the shooting, a construction worker spotted a man entering a wooded area near the Waffle House. Police converged on the location and took Travis Ranking into custody. He was dressed. He was carrying a backpack containing water, sunscreen, a pistol, ammunition, a Bible, and several silver bars. He asked to speak with an attorney. In the months after his arrest, a mental competency evaluation found Ranking unfit to stand trial due to severe schizophrenia, and he was committed to a psychiatric facility for treatment. By October 2018, a judge determined he had been sufficiently restored to competency. Prosecutors announced in January 2020 they would not seek the death penalty. His trial finally began January 31st, 2022, nearly 4 years after the shooting. Ranking pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, With the defense presenting two forensic psychologists who testified that Reinking had been in the grip of a severe schizophrenic episode and genuinely believed he was acting on a command from God. The prosecution countered methodically, pointing to the fact that Reinking had purchased ammunition in the days before the shooting, driven deliberately to a specific location, chosen the pre-dawn hours when the restaurant would be less crowded, and had asked for an attorney upon arrest. They argued each of those choices demonstrated a man who understood what he was doing and why. Jurors deliberated and returned on February 4, 2022, guilty on all 16 counts, including 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. The insanity defense had failed entirely. At the sentencing hearing, James Shaw Jr. brought his 8-year-old daughter to the courtroom and stood before Travis Reinking, pointing to her, telling him directly that he had almost not made it home to his child because of what Reinking had done. He told the court he saw D'Ebony Groves in his daughter's face. Judge Mark Fishburne sentenced Reinking to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, each murder stacked on top of the last. James Shaw Jr. was called a hero by nearly everyone. He accepted the title reluctantly. "I did that," he said, "that completely out of a selfish act." He raised over $100,000 for the victims' families in the weeks after the shooting. In 2018, Chadwick Boseman handed him the BET Hero Award on live television, stepping aside from his own win to put the spotlight where he believed it belonged. Jeffrey Reinking, Travis's father, who returned the guns, was convicted in May 2022 of unlawfully delivering a firearm and sentenced to 18 months in prison. The 4 people killed that night were Torian Sanderlin, Joe Perez Jr., Aquila Da Silva, and D'Ebony Groves. They were between 20 and 29 years old. They were out late, eating breakfast, living their lives. They didn't know Travis Reinking. They had nothing to do with whatever war was unfolding inside his mind. And that, in the end, is what made that parking lot on Murfreesboro Pike so terrifying. Not just what happened there, but how random and how preventable it truly was. The next case takes us from a chaotic pre-dawn shooting to something arguably more disturbing. A man who live-streamed his own killing spree across Memphis in broad daylight as thousands watched in real time. Number 7. Ezekiel Kelly. The dinner had been casual. A group of friends gathered at a house in the Raleigh neighborhood of Memphis, eating chicken from a food truck business one of them was building. 19-year-old Ezekiel Kelly was among them. Yet witnesses later told police that at some point during the evening, Kelly made a comment, almost offhand, about killing someone. He said, "Watch this. Nobody moved, nobody left." It was the kind of remark that gets dismissed in the moment, until the moment passes and you realize it wasn't a remark at all. It was a warning. Ezekiel Kelly was born October 14, 2002, and grew up in the Raleigh neighborhood on the north side of Memphis, a community that youth advocates who knew him described as one that offered very little in the way of structure or opportunity for the young people who grew up there. He dropped out of school early and spent his adolescence cycling through the juvenile system. By 17, his exposure to violence had been both chronic and formative. In February 2020, he was charged as an adult with criminal attempted first-degree murder, a reckless endangerment, and using a firearm to commit a dangerous felony in connection with a Memphis shooting in which 2 people were wounded. Those were serious charges. Charges that, had they held, would have meant years behind bars. Instead, Kelly negotiated a plea to the reduced charge of aggravated assault. In April 2021, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He served 11 months. On March 16, 2022, accounting for time already served awaiting trial, Ezekiel Kelly was released. As he was 19 years old, still on the street in Memphis, and still carrying everything that had brought him to that plea agreement in the first place. Less than 6 months later, he made the entire country watch. The night of September 6th into the early morning of September 7th, 2022, Kelly was at that gathering in Raleigh. At approximately 12:56 in the morning, he pulled 24-year-old Dwayne Tunstall aside from the group. And Tunstall, a young father described by those who loved him as someone who pushed all his friends towards something better, who had dreams in music and was building a food truck business, was shot once in the head in the driveway. 3 witnesses were present. They identified Kelly from a photo lineup without hesitation. Kelly drove away into the early morning dark of Memphis and did not stop. For the next 16 hours, the city of Memphis became something no American city had been in quite this way before. A real-time crime scene, unfolding not just on police scanners and news alerts, but on a phone screen in full color, narrated by the man committing the crimes. At 4:38 that afternoon, a 62-year-old man named Richard Clark was sitting in his car at a gas station on South Parkway East. Their surveillance footage captured what happened next, with brutal clarity. A gray sedan pulled alongside Clark's vehicle, windows down, and multiple shots were fired through the driver's side window. Clark was pronounced dead at the scene. Kelly drove away. Less than 2 minutes later, a woman was shot in the leg at the intersection of Norris Road and Interstate 240. She had been sitting in her car with her father, who was fixing a flat tire, when Kelly pulled up. They asked her for directions to Whitehaven and opened fire after she answered. She survived. Then, somewhere around that stretch of Norris Road heading eastbound, Ezekiel Kelly picked up his phone and went live on Facebook. What followed was viewed by thousands of people in real time before the platform could remove it. In the video, Kelly rambled about being a hitman, confessed to killing Tunstall, mocked the victim by name, talked about being high, and described plans to continue until police killed him in a final confrontation. He was driving between crime scenes, narrating his own rampage, visible foam at the corners of his mouth. At 5:50 in the afternoon, he pulled into an AutoZone on Jackson Avenue, walked inside, and shot a man in the chest while the camera was still running. He walked back out of the store, shouting about what he had just done. Then he ended the stream. By 6 o'clock, the city of Memphis had received the tip it needed. Kelly's own mother and sister called police to report that they had seen their son and brother on Facebook Live threatening to harm civilians. A shelter-in-place order went out across Memphis. The Memphis Area Transit Authority suspended all bus and trolley service. The University of Memphis locked its gates. AutoZone Park downtown evacuated thousands of fans mid-game as the minor league Memphis Redbirds halted play. The entire city had gone into lockdown. The rampage was not over. At 7:21 that evening on Poplar Avenue near North Evergreen, Kelly approached a gray Toyota SUV stopped in traffic. 38-year-old Allison Parker was inside, a mother of 3 who worked as a medical assistant at a clinic just across the state line in West Memphis, Arkansas. Her daughter was with her and tried to get out of the car to help her mother escape. Kelly entered the vehicle through the passenger side and shot Allison Parker. She died. He took her SUV and fled west. On Poplar Avenue, he also shot a man in the arm and fired through the pants leg of a nearby bystander. He kept moving. Kelly crossed the state line into South Haven, Mississippi, where he committed another carjacking at gunpoint, this time leaving the driver unharmed. Memphis police spotted the stolen Dodge Challenger he was now driving on Interstate 55. Then a high-speed pursuit followed. Kelly crashed the vehicle and was taken into custody without further violence. 2 firearms were recovered from the car. The rampage had spanned 7 shooting scenes, at least 2 carjackings, multiple neighborhoods, and more than 1 state, beginning before 1 in the morning and ending just before 9 at night. 3 people were dead from Kelly's hand: Dwayne Tunstall, Richard Clark, and Allison Parker. 3 more had been shot and wounded. A 4th victim, a young woman initially identified as a fatality, was later confirmed by police to have been killed by a different suspect entirely on that same day. A separate, unrelated tragedy in the same city on the same night. In the aftermath, the city erupted. Memphis Mayor Jim Strickland stood before cameras, pounding the podium. If Mr. Kelly served his full 3-year sentence, he said, he would still be in prison today. 8 and 4 of our fellow citizens would still be alive. The Shelby County District Attorney, newly elected, stood beside him and called for a broader approach to crime and rehabilitation. The exchange was raw, public, and captured the exact fault line that the Kelly case had cracked open. What does accountability look like, and who is responsible when it fails? Prosecutors announced in March 2023 that they would seek the death penalty if Kelly was convicted at trial. His trial was delayed multiple times as defense attorneys cited the extraordinary scope of the case. 7 crime scenes, 3 homicides, nearly 400 potential witnesses. Then, on August 13, 2025, Ezekiel Kelly entered a Memphis courtroom, took the stand, and pleaded guilty to 28 charges, including 3 counts of first-degree murder. Shelby County Judge James Jones, Jr. sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 221 additional years. The deal, confirmed by attorneys, had been approved by the families of every victim. The death penalty was taken off the table. Standing before the judge, Kelly cried. He wiped his eyes. He said there was nothing he could offer the families of the people he had killed that would give them any closure. He said he had been in the darkest place of his life that day. Yet his attorney said Kelly told him he would rather serve life in prison than be buried. He was 22 years old. Dwayne Tunstall wanted to make it in music. Richard Clark was 62 years old and had stopped for gas. Allison Parker was a mother of 3 on her way home. None of them had any connection to Ezekiel Kelly. All of them are gone. And the city of Memphis, which had already been shaken that same week by the murder of a school teacher taken during her morning jog, had spent the fall of 2022 trying to understand how so much could break apart so fast. That teacher's story, the abduction of Eliza Fletcher and the man who took her, is the final case on this list, and it is one of the most chilling the city has ever seen. Number 8. Eliza Fletcher. She had done everything right. She had mapped her route, laced up her shoes in the dark, and stepped outside before the city woke up, the way she did every morning, the way dedicated runners do when they carve out their miles before the rest of the world begins to move. It was 4 o'clock in the morning on September 2nd, 2022, and Eliza Fletcher had no reason to believe that morning would be any different from every other morning. She had run those same streets near the University of Memphis. She was 34 years old, a wife, a mother of 2, a kindergarten teacher who her students' parents described with the kind of warmth that takes years to earn. She was, by every account, exactly the person everyone around her believed her to be. And she was running alone in the dark when a man decided to take her life. Eliza Fletcher was born into one of Memphis's most prominent families, the granddaughter of Joseph Hyde, the billionaire founder of AutoZone, one of the largest automotive retail chains in the country. She had grown up surrounded by wealth and opportunity, but those who knew her said it never defined how she moved through the world. That she attended St. Mary's Episcopal School as a child, and eventually came back to that same institution as a kindergarten teacher because teaching young children was what she wanted to do. She married Richie Fletcher, and they had 2 sons together. Her faith was central to her life. Her church community, her school community, her neighborhood, each circle that knew her used versions of the same language: kind, radiant, present. She made people feel seen. She ran before dawn most mornings, a habit shared by many serious runners who want to beat the heat or simply find the rare quiet of empty streets. The stretch near the University of Memphis campus had become routine, familiar. On the morning of September 2nd, surveillance cameras captured what she could not have known was happening behind her. A man was watching and then moving. Cleotha Abston was 40 years old in September 2022. And though his criminal history stretched back to a time when he was barely old enough to be tried as an adult. In the year 2000, when he was 16, he had kidnapped a prominent Memphis attorney at gunpoint and held him captive. He was convicted, sentenced, and served 20 years in state prison. He was released in 2020. By September 2021, just 1 year after his release, records would later show he had committed another violent crime, the kidnapping and assault of a woman named Alicia Franklin, who he had met through a dating application, and who would ultimately testify against him years later. A rape kit was collected from Franklin in 2021. It sat in a processing backlog. It was not linked to Abston until after his arrest in the Fletcher case, a revelation that would ignite a broader public conversation about delayed forensic testing in Memphis cases and how many attacks might have been prevented by faster results. Shortly before 4 in the morning on September 2nd, 2022, surveillance footage captured Cleotha Abston chasing Eliza Fletcher on foot near the University of Memphis campus. After a struggle, he forced her into the passenger seat of a black SUV registered to a family member. The vehicle sat parked for approximately 4 minutes. Then it drove away. When Eliza Fletcher did not return home from her run, her husband called the police. Within hours, a cyclist found her cell phone lying in the street, along with a pair of sandals, placed near the spot where she had last been seen. Investigators responded quickly and with focus. Forensic technicians processed the sandals. Within 24 hours of the abduction, police had a DNA match. The profile returned in the database belonged to Cleotha Abston, a man already in the system from his prior conviction. Officers located the black SUV near his residence that same day. When they moved in to arrest him, he attempted to flee. He was taken into custody. From the moment of Eliza Fletcher's disappearance to the arrest of her abductor, less than 36 hours. But Eliza Fletcher had not been found. Memphis held a collective breath for 3 days. Search teams covered the city. Thousands followed updates in real time on social media and local news. Then, on September 5th, investigators located her body behind a vacant duplex in South Memphis, about 20 minutes from the spot where she had been forced into the SUV. The autopsy revealed she had died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head. There were also injuries to her leg and fractures to her jaw. She had not died quickly or easily. The medical examiner's findings were among the most devastating details of an already devastating case. The city of Memphis, already shaken that same week by the Ezekiel Kelly shooting rampage, processed a second shock on top of the first. The fact that both cases converged on the same few days in September 2022 produced a kind of civic grief that residents and city leaders described as something they had never experienced before. Vigils were held. 8 runners across Memphis and in cities nationwide organized pre-dawn runs in Eliza's honor, a tradition that continued on the anniversary of her death the following year and beyond. Cleotha Abston was charged with first-degree murder, especially aggravated kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and unlawful possession of a firearm. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty if he was convicted at trial. Before the Fletcher case even went to trial, Abston faced justice in the 2021 Franklin case. In April 2024, a jury found him guilty of aggravated rape, aggravated kidnapping, and weapons charges. In May 2024, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison for those convictions. 40 years for the rape, 20 for the kidnapping, and 20 for the gun charge, all running consecutively. His trial in the Fletcher murder was scheduled to begin February 10, 2025, but on October 28, 2024, Abston appeared in Shelby County Court and changed course. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, especially aggravated kidnapping, and tampering with evidence in Eliza Fletcher's death. Shelby County Judge James Jones, Jr. sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder, and 40 additional years for the kidnapping, all to run concurrently, stacked on top of the 80 years already handed down in the Franklin case. Our prosecutors had negotiated the plea with the full support of the Fletcher family, who had communicated their desire for finality over the prolonged uncertainty of a capital trial. By accepting the deal, Abston also surrendered his right to any future appeals. District Attorney Steve Mulroy read the Fletcher family's statement aloud in open court. It was directed at Abston, that they had no idea what had happened in his life to make him the person he had become, but that nothing excused it or explained it, that he had changed their lives irreparably, that Eliza had not done anything to deserve what happened to her, that she would have been, the family said, among the first to help anyone who needed it. Abston did not respond publicly. His attorney told reporters that his client had accepted the deal because life in prison was preferable to execution. He will die behind bars. His sentence in the Franklin case runs consecutive to his sentence in the Fletcher case, meaning he will never again be a free man under any legal circumstance. Every year since 2022, runners in Memphis have gathered before dawn on the anniversary of Eliza Fletcher's abduction and run the route she loved. They finished the miles she didn't get to finish. Her family has said that she meant so much to so many, that her smile radiated something real, that she would have been the first to help anyone who needed it. These are not the words people use to describe a symbol. They're the words you use for someone you actually knew and actually miss and cannot stop thinking about. Number 10. Byron Lewis Black. On the last night of her life, Angela Clay finished her Sunday shift at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where she worked as a lab technician, and walked out to find her boyfriend waiting in the parking lot to give her a ride home. It was late, around 10 o'clock in the evening on March 27, 1988. By all accounts, Angela had not been expecting him, And by all accounts, the relationship between Angela Clay and Byron Lewis Black had never been a peaceful one. What she could not have known as she got into that car was that she would not survive the night, and neither would her daughters. Byron Lewis Black was born March 23, 1956, and grew up in Nashville. He did not come from the kind of background that offered much in the way of stability or direction, and by adulthood, he had built a record that spoke to a pattern of volatility and violence. His relationship with Angela Clay carried those same qualities from early on. Family members who knew them both later told investigators that the dynamic between Byron and Angela had been defined by jealousy and control on his part, and by attempts to establish independence on hers. Angela had 2 daughters, 9-year-old LaToya and 6-year-old Lakeisha, from her marriage to a man named Benny Clay, from whom she had separated. She was 35 years old, working a steady job at one of Nashville's most prestigious medical institutions, and, according to people close to her, she had been quietly considering reconciling with her estranged husband. Byron Black found out, and according to family members, he made his feelings about it perfectly clear. He told people in terms that left no ambiguity that he would not allow it. He referenced a specific act of violence, a phrase investigators later documented as a threat to pull a Sterling Gray, alluding to a local case in which a man had killed a woman who tried to leave him. Black had also demonstrated more than once that his threats were not empty. In December of 1986, roughly 15 months before the murders, he had gotten into a confrontation with Benny Clay and shot him in the shoulder. Benny survived. Black was convicted of a felony for that shooting and sentenced to 2 years at the Metro Workhouse, a Nashville jail facility, with work release privileges that allowed him to leave on weekends. He was out on one of those weekend furloughs on the night he picked Angela up from Vanderbilt. In the early morning hours of March 28th, May 1988, inside the Clay family apartment at 1101 Wade Avenue in South Nashville, Byron Black shot Angela Clay once in the head while she lay in her bed. She died within minutes. Her daughter LaToya, 9 years old, was also shot in the master bedroom. 6-year-old Lakeisha was found shot in another part of the apartment. All 3 had been killed with a firearm. There were no signs of forced entry. And Black had been inside that home before. Court records showed he had previously kicked in the front door during an earlier dispute, and investigators had no difficulty establishing that he had been present that night. He returned to the workhouse after the furlough. The following day, a neighbor discovered the bodies. The investigation moved with speed and purpose. The evidence against Black was substantial from the start. 3 separate people he had worked with and lived around would eventually testify in court that he had made explicit prior threats to kill Angela and her daughters. The history of domestic violence, the prior shooting of Benny Clay, the life insurance policy questions, the timeline of his furlough. Everything pointed in one direction. On March 28, 1989, exactly 1 year after the murders, a Davidson County jury convicted Byron Lewis Black on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The jury sentenced him to death for the murder of 6-year-old Lakeisha Clay, the youngest victim, and to 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Angela and LaToya. He maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest through every subsequent hearing, appeal, and courtroom appearance over the next 36 years. What followed was one of the longest legal journeys in Tennessee death row history. Black filed appeals and post-conviction petitions throughout the 1990s and 2000s. At each one rejected, his attorneys argued ineffective counsel. They challenged the jury instructions. They raised constitutional questions about proportionality. Every avenue was closed. Then, in 2020, a new and more consequential argument emerged. Black's defense team argued that he had an intellectual disability, a condition that, under a 2002 Supreme Court ruling in Atkins v. Virginia, categorically bars a person from being executed. Multiple psychologists were brought in to evaluate him. Well, the results were disputed. One district attorney in Nashville, Glenn Funk, actually filed a petition in 2022 conceding that Black was intellectually disabled and should be removed from death row, an extraordinary and nearly unprecedented move by a prosecutor. But courts ultimately rejected that concession as not legally binding, and Black remained on death row. By 2025, Black was 69 years old. Court filings described him as a frail, wheelchair-bound man suffering from dementia. brain damage, kidney disease, and congestive heart failure. He had been implanted with an internal cardioverter defibrillator, a device designed to detect dangerous heart rhythms and deliver an electric shock to restore normal function. His attorneys argued that this device created a unique and serious risk. As lethal injection drugs stopped his heart, the defibrillator would detect the cardiac event and attempt to shock him back to life, potentially multiple times, creating a prolonged and torturous death in violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. A Davidson County Chancery Court judge agreed with that specific argument and ruled in July 2025 that the state must deactivate the device before proceeding. But the Tennessee Attorney General's office appealed to the state Supreme Court, which reversed the ruling. A Nashville hospital that had briefly been identified as a potential location for deactivating the device issued a statement, clarifying it had never agreed to participate and had no role in state executions. On the eve of the execution, the United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. Governor Bill Lee rejected a clemency petition. The execution was cleared to proceed. On the morning of August 5, 2025, at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, the curtain to the execution chamber opened at approximately 10:30 in the morning. Byron Lewis Black was strapped to the gurney and covered with a white sheet. The pentobarbital, Tennessee's new single-drug lethal injection protocol, began to flow. What happened next was witnessed by 7 media representatives and described by every single one of them in nearly identical terms. Black began breathing loudly. He groaned repeatedly, and he turned to his spiritual advisor who was present in the chamber and, audibly, loudly enough for witnesses to hear, said, "This is hurting so bad." The distress lasted for several minutes before he lost consciousness. His time of death was recorded as 10:43 in the morning. He had no final statement. When asked if he had last words, he said only, "No, sir," before the pain that would become the final documented words of his life made itself known. An autopsy released on September 10, 2025, found evidence of pulmonary edema, a buildup of fluid in the lungs that medical experts describe as producing sensations of drowning, panic, and suffocation. It was the same finding documented in approximately 3/4 of lethal injection autopsies examined in a broad national study, raising questions that attorneys, medical professionals, and death penalty opponents said could no longer be dismissed as theoretical. Angela Clay's sister, Lynette Bell, that stood before the cameras outside Riverbend after the execution and addressed those watching. She said she was grateful and thankful to finally see this day. She said she could not feel sorry for Byron Black, because in 37 years, not once, not in any courtroom, not in any letter, not in any final statement, did he ever apologize. He never admitted what he had done. He never acknowledged LaToya or Lakeisha or Angela by name in any expression of remorse. "Like we never got an apology," Bell said. He never admitted it. And with that, the Clay family's 37-year wait for a formal conclusion came to its end. Angela Clay was 35. LaToya was 9. Lakeisha was 6. They were killed in their home, in their beds, by a man who had threatened their lives and who the justice system had placed back on the street on a weekend pass. Their names are the ones that belong at the center of this story, not because the legal debates that surrounded Byron Black's execution were without merit, but because whatever argument surrounds the method of justice, the reason justice was sought at all was them.